Hey internets, censorship is the ultimate example of a topic where there is a very large disconnect between the positions that people claim to have and the positions that people often actually have. It's not really a big secret that when you ask your average person whether or not they dislike censorship, most people will say that they dislike censorship. People in the age of liberalism will almost overwhelmingly say that they are pro-free speech. And yet, when you take a look around the world and the laws that people actually end up supporting and the kinds of discussions that happen in political and also sadly many academic circles, it would be more accurate to say that people tend to claim they dislike censorship, but often only for the ideas that they either like or are neutral towards, but not so much the ideas that they either view as offensive or disagree with. There was a Knight Foundation survey on free expression in America back in 2020 that had some pretty interesting data in it that showcases this disconnect. In the United States, if you look at Democrats and what they consider to be important to free speech, they'll say that racial injustice protests are really high on the list. But then when it comes to censorship and online misinformation, with the example given being conspiracy theories about the COVID vaccine, all of a sudden they turn a 180 and are suddenly against free speech and are suddenly very pro-censorship. And what this shows is that there's a very big flaw in the way a lot of people think about censorship and why it doesn't work. It shows us that a huge portion of people only think it doesn't work simply because it's hard to hide the truth. Or in other words, they only believe that censorship doesn't work when it's censoring a true idea. But as long as it's censoring a quote-unquote false idea, then that's perfectly fine. And so this video is going to set out to prove why this is just completely and utterly, and in many ways actually somewhat dangerously wrong. The reality is that censorship fails for a completely different reason that most people are actually quite unaware of, that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not what is being censored is true. And spoiler alert, I'll be going over some pretty offensive topics in this video to show why this is the case. Things out there like flat earthism or Holocaust denial, and things like eugenics and race realism, as well as just some controversial public figures. Like for example, Nick Fuentes, who I mentioned in one of my previous videos. And so yes, for those of you who are not new to my channel, this video will be the first of a few videos that I'm going to be doing, where I'll be going a little bit more in depth into the topics I covered in the Groyper question. But first off, no, it's not just because a lot of times people can get around censorship and bannings and whatnot by using VPNs or Tor or whatever in order to circumvent online moderation, although that is a tiny part of it. Speaking of which, this video's sponsor is private internet access. A lot of people unfortunately still don't quite understand why you need a VPN while using the internet. And it's often the same old fallacy of thinking that if you aren't doing anything wrong, then you don't need privacy. Yeah, no. This mentality will trap you in the mindset that it's perfectly fine for government and hackers to be able to effectively stand behind your back and watch everything you are doing. The reality is, whether it's those hackers trying to steal your identity, your credit cards, your passwords, and other personal data, or the surveillance state or copyright trolls, a VPN remains the best way to protect yourself from these problems at a cost that is significantly less than the danger of using the internet unprotected. Private internet access solves the problem for you by using RAM-only no-log servers and top-of-the-line encryption to mask your IP online and stop potential bad actors from stealing your info. Not only are they a top-quality VPN, but their app is stable, user-friendly, and available on all of your devices without limitations. PIA also comes with excellent downloading and upload speeds, tons of security features, and one particular favorite is that it is very streamer-friendly. They have servers all over the world you can choose from, and many of them are optimized for Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, Disney and Paramount Plus, etc., etc. And you can use PIA to unlock the geo-restricted content on streaming services, allowing you access to a much wider variety of movies and TV shows. It is also very affordable. If you use my personal link in the description below, you can get private internet access now for 83% off at only $2.03 per month, plus 4 months free, and all covered with a 30-day money-back, risk-free guarantee. Seriously, it's a good VPN, get it. Anyways, to explain the real reason why censorship fails, let's start out with genetics and biorealism, because it's not really exactly a very big secret that anybody who suggests genetics as an explanation for various differences in ethnic outcomes will often find themselves getting marched out of Harvard if they're an academic. It's pretty much considered the most efficient tactic for the decredentialization speedrun. But what's more interesting is the very weird justifications that some boomer libs will give for the perpetuation of this kind of censorship censorship. So let's take a look at this absolutely beautiful post from X that commits an insane amount of logical fallacies in a way that beautifully exposes what the real problem with censorship is. He says, the reasons we have taboos about studying race and intelligence is not morality but experience. There's a shockingly copious history of the topic attracting pseudoscience. While knowledge of the subject shouldn't be off limits per se, the risk of bad science masquerading as knowledge is prohibitive. Now, there are several problems with his argument here. The most obvious problem that, at best, this is just a guilt by association fallacy. Just because bad studies in a subject have come out in regards to a specific data set doesn't automatically mean that any new study about the same subject must also be bad and have the same associations with the people who originally pushed out bad research. It's also a very weird double standard, because if we applied this same logic to other fields of science, let's just say medical science for example, we would have to reject any new theory about how disease spreads or how it is treated because of the history of medical science having a lot of various failings in that very theory. The field of medicine has gotten that very idea of what it is and how to treat it wrong very, very many times, actually. But the biggest problem, and the one we really care about here in regards to censorship and why it doesn't work, comes down to a very simple question. Does making a subject in academic research taboo make it easier or harder to discern what is and what isn't misinformation about that subject? And the answer, of course, is that it actually makes it harder. Just think of any kind of random disease that medical science doesn't currently understand very well, and perhaps has a history of quackery in how it is treated. If we were to take that history of quack medicine and use it to justify tabooing any kind of research into that disease, that would just make it so that we never figure out the truth of the disease. In fact, it would actually just make it so that the quack medicine approach would be the most recent data we have on it. But the thing is, that's effectively what the censorship does. It makes it so that you now have a lack of evidence because new evidence isn't being generated. And indeed, when we look at online discussions regarding the question of genetics and its impact on ethnic outcomes, the race realism debate is filled with people just kind of posting the IQ map as if it is gospel truth. And the thing is, part of the reason you can get away with posting the IQ map, when you think about it, is actually because of the taboo on the subject. We actually don't have enough good data yet to completely refute this. Because of course, the real effect of making a subject taboo, particularly in this context of genetic research, is that certain studies just don't end up getting done. There's actually a very large disagreement in people who study psychometrics on what exactly the percentage of genetic effect is on the average G factor of different population groups. And part of that is just because a lot of the studies that we would need to do to be able to narrow that down and get closer to the truth of what that percentage most likely is, well, those studies just don't get funded, and the taboo in this subject is almost certainly part of the problem. And thus, the real problem with censorship, the real reason it doesn't work, is that all it really does is it makes the ideas surrounding the topic that is being censored more difficult to challenge. Because when you make a subject taboo, that obviously doesn't magically make the subject go away. I've seen this a lot in Reddit moderators when they ban someone from their subreddit. That ban obviously does not make the idea they believed that made you want to ban them mysteriously vanish. Their views are still the same. In fact, they're probably angrier now because they got banned, which actually incentivizes people to spread that idea even further. It's an idea. Ideas, once created, are not scarce. As soon as someone has had that initial thought, that thought can be communicated to everybody else ad nauseum, and then they can multiply it further ad nauseum. And so when an institution, or even just an online forum, or really whatever, decides to ban a topic, make it taboo, decredential anybody who brings it up, ban research in regards to certain scientific subjects, all that does is really just ban it from that tiny circle of reality from which it has been banned. But the idea is still there. You haven't actually gotten rid of it. All you've really done is made it so that the people who don't like the idea are now ignoring it, which means that that idea will now spread amongst people who don't really care as much. And because you decided to censor the idea instead of treating it with actual good faith, now you don't actually have any good evidence generated against the idea. And thus, once that which has been censored inevitably comes back to bite the people who wanted to just sweep the problem under the rug by censoring it, they are actually less equipped to deal with the idea. idea, because they have less useful knowledge available to them to challenge that idea. But ignoring the whole genetics discussion, another problem just when it comes to academia is that censorship is also deeply unscientific. The purpose of peer review is not to ban entire fields of study from the cathedral, but rather to refine the study by conducting better research that can be replicated and objectively proven. This is a stereotypical example of the difference between science as a method for discerning what is true and what is not, and the science worshiper method followed by people who think that science itself is true. This is incorrect. Science is a way to figure out truth. It's a way of finding correct knowledge, but it is absolutely not truth in itself. This may seem like a small difference, but it's actually massive, and not understanding that difference is where we get boneheaded, mid-witted takes like this. So he's basically saying that the answer to pseudoscience about a subject is less science about the subject, which is just obviously ridiculous on its face. And we can see this reason for censorship's failure in a lot of other things. Like, let's move on to the Epstein files as another example. As we all know by now, most likely if you've kept up with this story in any length of detail, the main problem with the Epstein files release is that much of the useful information has been completely redacted. It's blacked out or it's been removed from the files entirely. And of course, what does this censoring of this information do? Does this censorship prevent any conspiracy theories about the Epstein files from getting out and being discussed? Well, obviously no, of course not. If you're reading the internet at all, you can see that the conspiracy theories regarding the Epstein files are completely off the charts. Everybody is having their own theory about it because you don't know what's actually in that blacked out section. And so what happens is people just come up with their own ideas and run with it. And why are they able to run with it and get away with it? Well, because we don't know the truth, and thus we cannot challenge those conspiracy theories. And so once again, we see the same problem, the root problem of censorship. Since we don't have access to the best evidence, but people obviously still care about the idea, the logical conclusion of that is that people are just going to start making up their own reality. And on this subject, this is actually something I believe that Trump kind of screwed himself on. By dragging his feet to release the Epstein files and having them released in this kind of half-arsed, blacked out, censored way, Trump may have unwittingly made a very big mistake. Because now, since there's been so much time to let the pot stew, as you could say, in regards to the discussion regarding the Epstein files, even if all of the evidence completely unredacted and completely uncensored would be to release tomorrow, and all of that evidence would completely exonerate Trump and show that he did nothing wrong, I'm pretty sure a lot of people on the lib left especially would still believe that Trump had done something wrong and still believe things like Trump was assaulting underage girls or something like that. They would still be spreading all of the rumors about Trump being a PDF file. Whether or not that's true really doesn't matter because Orange Man bad. And there could be something in Trump's grand master plan as to why he's doing it like this, but I suspect that this is a case of just a genuine misstep, because even if he's completely innocent, I don't really think there's anything he can do to stop the media from pinning the Epstein problem on him. Too much time has kind of passed without any access to good evidence regarding it, and so people have already been given too long to theorize and had too much time, and so what has happened is many people have kind of already drawn their final conclusion on the Epstein matter and whether or not Trump himself took part in PDF Island, and there's not really much you can say to prove to them otherwise. And so once again, in a completely unrelated subject, censorship has accomplished absolutely nothing other than preventing conjecture and ideas that may or may not be true from properly being challenged, all due to a lack of reliable information at the time. Next up, another really good example is the failure of big tech censoring the alt-right movement. Many of you may remember the story, but for those of you who don't, I'll give a quick rundown. Gamergate happened around the early 2010s, ultimately kicking off a massive anti-SJW movement on the internet, which led to the rise of a lot of now prominent right-wing content creators like Sargon of Akkad, along with a few other examples like Black Pigeon Speaks, or even Millennial Woes. And while their reasons and views may differ, the basic gist of it is that all of them have a couple things in common, one being loosely right-wing and anti-SJW, with pretty strong messaging against woke ideology and feminism, etc., etc. But the more important one here, of course this being a video about why censorship doesn't work, is that they've all been banned or suspended or demonetized by big tech at some point in internet history, with the most common being the noted purges within big tech that happened between 2017 to 2019, which also coincided with the most likely likely not exactly organic rise of BreadTube. Part of it may have been organic, but part of it may have them just been getting boosted for having correct opinion good boy points. That's kind of a subject for another video, to be honest. The point here, though, is that despite all of those people I mentioned getting banned or suspended in some way, all of them are still relatively pretty well known. Millennial Woe's return to X has actually been kind of going viral recently. Black Pigeon Speaks channel is still going somehow, but Sargon of Akkad especially is honestly even more well known now than he was, having built almost an entire media empire on his own. And so the big tech censorship, it was a setback for them at the time. It didn't really do much in the long run. And one of the reasons for that shows another problem with censorship, which is that it often makes the people doing the censorship look neurotic and deranged. This is probably one of the bigger differences between political and scientific discourse. When you censor someone politically, not only does it kind of prevent actual good data from entering the discussion, and thus the good data is less able to challenge the bad data, when it comes to politics, it just makes the person on the side doing the censorship look like a tyrant. It brings it with it the automatic question, okay, are you just not capable of dealing with this discourse in any kind of honest, good faith manner? You just have to ban them from the scene entirely? That question just immediately comes up, and it kind of immediately drowns out any kind of discussion of whether or not they're correct, because people will actually just start to assume that they're correct because they are being censored. Because everybody kind of intuitively knows that banning somebody from the debate stage is effectively just kind of cheating. You haven't actually defeated their ideas, you've just pulled shenanigans in order to get rid of them so that you don't have to defeat their ideas, which is very close to admitting that you can't defeat those ideas. In fact, you might as well admit defeat at that point. And indeed, you can find some pretty funny copes that are proving this. For example, a lot of the SJW types during that time, if you ask them about those people getting banned and shadow banned, they'll actually try and deflect from the topic and deny reality altogether. They'll try to claim that breadtubers were getting banned just as much, or give very silly, nonsensical reasons for why big tech is actually biased against socialists, despite the fact that it absolutely isn't. Because again, everybody knows that censorship is cheating when it comes to political discourse, and so denial of that wrongdoing ends up being a legitimate strategy, even though it's just completely insane and obviously wrong. The question of which side is correct and which side is wrong and who has the facts on their side, who doesn't, etc., blah, 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 it kind of doesn't matter, because by pulling out the censorship card, you took away the ability to challenge those ideas, period. It also, of course, just ended up moving a lot of discussions of the alt-right and the new online right, and other various right-wing leaning ideologies, like me being a libertarian Hoppian as well. A lot of people with various different right-wing ideologies, well, we just kind of ended up discussing them on other places of the internet that did allow free speech. And this, of course, opened up the door for Nick Fuentes and people like him. The attempt to censor the Groypers has possibly been the greatest censorship fail in modern history, which adds to another problem. Not only does censorship make an idea or a group or a person or a group representing those ideas, not only does it make it harder to challenge them because you don't have access to good data and you haven't prepared to challenge them, it also can make people more interested in the idea simply because it has been censored, also known as the Barbra Streisand Effect, named after, of course, Barbra Streisand, trying to make it so that people weren't allowed to talk about where her mansion was located, where she attempted to actually sue the photographer who took a picture of her mansion off of Malibu, California, in an attempt to get the picture taken away. This, of course, just made everybody more interested in the picture, thus causing more people to become aware of where her mansion is located, when that's exactly what she didn't want people to do. In other words, censorship can have the unintended consequence in people becoming more interested in the information being censored. And I would honestly argue that the Streisand Effect should be renamed the Groyper Effect, because Fuentes was effectively banned and demonetized or restricted or suspended at the very least from just about every major big tech platform. Twitch, Reddit, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, even going as far to get debanked and deplatformed from payment processors, like Venmo and PayPal, Stripe, etc. And all of it, as we can see now today, was ultimately for nothing, because what it did is it just made him into an effective martyr against censorship. It just made people more interested in what he had to say. It's just kind of a basic psychological phenomenon. When someone gets censored, a lot of the people's knee-jerk reaction is to assume that the people doing the censoring are, again, just cheating on the debate stage. The immediate assumption is that, okay, you're censoring this person, and a good reason could just be that you're censoring them because you can't deal with what they're saying. Whether or not that's true and whether or not they actually do have good ideas is kind of irrelevant, because the very act of censorship is often viewed as just an act of admitting defeat. And you can see this pretty obviously when you try to engage in any kind of manner of the Jewish question with a groyper. One of the big aces up their sleeves, one of the main arguments they will use to try and prove that it's the Jews, is the fact that a lot of times when someone says it's the Jews, they will immediately get censored and deplatformed and demonetized, etc., often by someone with ties to the Jews. And so thus these acts of censorship ironically end up being one of their best arguments in their favor. It just draws more people to their cause. If you ever get into psychology, one of the basic concepts is the concept of the forbidden fruit. When you tell someone, no, you can't have this, no, you can't think this, you naughty, naughty boy, you, all that does is it just makes people more interested in it. It makes people want it more. And what really emphasizes how this strategy of censorship can backfire is that there's some conspiracy theorists out there who have ideas that are actually not being censored, but they'll desperately try to pretend like they are being censored. Like, for example, the Flat Earth Society. Flat Earthers, if you talk to them, they'll try really, really hard to use the same argument that the groypers use. They'll try to claim and say that Flat Earth is being censored, when it really isn't, at least not to any kind of meaningful degree. They do get visibility filtered, however, that's partially just due to the fact that people aren't really interested in them. But they certainly aren't outright banned like some of the groyper arguments are. People who are interested can still search for Flat Earth stuff and pretty easily find it. If you search Flat Earth Wiki, for example, it's the third result on Google, at least as I'm making this video. Whereas if you tried to find places where groypers primarily hang out and discuss with each other back in 2022 or so, it was actually pretty darn difficult, especially if you didn't already know about 4chan. And what this all shows is that being censored in some ways is actually a form of intellectual currency. A lot of the conspiracy theorist types actually want to be censored because then they can point to the authorities and say, aha, I told you they were conspiring against us. If they weren't conspiring against us, then why would they need to censor us? They absolutely love that stuff. There's nothing better you can do for a conspiracy theorist than to censor them. In many ways, it's actually the ultimate badge of honor. And one thing that can make this even worse is when the state gets involved. Because up until this point, I've been mainly focusing on the United States of America and big tech and private censorship, which honestly kind of wasn't really private. There was actually a lot of state involvement in it. But of course, over in Europe, as many of you may be familiar with, European countries tend to have actual laws against this stuff. And for very similar reasons, those laws have been painfully ineffective. For example, Holocaust denial, which is possibly the biggest example of how censorship prevents bad ideas from being challenged. Because the thing is, on the internet, when it comes to Holocaust discussion, one thing you might notice is that just about everywhere on the internet, since the Holocaust is kind of one of those things that is actually legally banned in many parts of the world, you have a secondary effect where most places on the internet either allow Holocaust denial and thus are filled with people denying the Holocaust, or they outright ban it, and thus they only have posts about people refuting Holocaust denial, but there's no actual discussion. For example, on places like Reddit where they have large posts refuting Holocaust denial, anybody who goes there to try and dispute it will then immediately get banned for denying the Holocaust. And part of that is just because they don't want state regulators from countries that ban Holocaust denials breathing down their necks. And so the result is that finding a debate, whether it be on forums or a live debate, that presents an actual good faith challenge to the Holocaust is extremely rare. It does happen, but you don't see it nearly as often as the popularity of the subject would suggest. And of course, the result is the same thing as the Groyper-Streisand effect. The biggest attack on the Holocaust is, of course, once again, the fact that questioning it is censored. And of course, the question of, oh, well, if it was true, then why aren't we allowed to question whether or not it's true? With the effect, rather than killing Holocaust denial, this is just ensured that its denial remained forever a question in people's minds due to it being a forbidden fruit. Rich and powerful elites don't want you to look at this, which means that everybody now wants to look at it. It's just how the human mind works. And it honestly makes sense from an incentive-based perspective. Like, for example, in any kind of political scandal, when a politician tries their hardest to prevent information from getting out, that usually coincides with an increased probability of them being guilty. And so there's another reason for the forbidden fruit effect. It's really just people recognizing the pattern that if some elite wants to sweep something under the rug, then more likely than not, there's something interesting under the rug. Whether or not it's actually true is completely irrelevant. The very act of censoring it makes people more interested. There are many other topics of historical revisionism that get thrown around all the time, but Holocaust denial consistently ranks as one of the most popular and hangout spots that allow it. And this is just made worse by the fact that this topic is not only taboo, but actually illegal in some countries, which just further disincentivizes a lot of normies from engaging with them. Because one of the problems with anti-free speech speech laws is the very question of context. Will a judge recognize that you were only talking about whether or not the Holocaust happened in order to refute your misguided friend who suspects that it didn't? Are you willing to put your very freedom in the hands of some state-appointed bureaucrat to determine the context and whether you walk or get the slammer? While the possibility of such a screw-up happening to you is extremely unlikely, the thing is it's not zero, and so it's thus not really worth the risk, and thus many of the Holocaust denial spaces remain even more immune to being challenged. And what makes this particular example kinda sad and weird is that when you look into the Holocaust and the evidence that it happened, there's plenty of evidence from a historical perspective to say that it happened. In order for it to not have happened would actually require multiple countries all somehow managing to correctly fudge their data in the same way, along with multiple other private agencies also having the same information, all of this happening well before the age of computers. It would have been very, very difficult to fake. And so in a twist of irony, I honestly imagine that if Holocaust denial was allowed, then it probably wouldn't even really be a subject that gets discussed very much very often. Or at the very least, it wouldn't be significantly more popular than other subjects of historical revision, or other cases of genocide denial. So if not for the forbidden fruit effect, and again the question of, oh, well, if this wasn't true, then why are they censoring it? A lot more people would probably be over it by now. And it also hints at the conclusion here, because making it illegal hints at the actual fallacy behind censorship, which is that the very act of censorship is actually just something known as an ad baculum fallacy, which is something that's also known as argument to the stick. It's effectively just appealing to force and fear. It's telling people that you're going to believe this or else. It's like someone saying X is true, and if you don't agree with me that X is true, I'm going to bomb your house. So do you agree that X is true? And while ad baculum in the moment, if the person making it actually does have a lot of power and authority behind them, it can be an on the surface convincing argument. Behind that, it's actually an extremely unconvincing argument. Ad baculum is probably one of those fallacies that just about every, even semi-rational, even below average intelligent people understand is not a good argument at all. Saying believe or else does not prove anything. But that's effectively what censorship is. It's just saying believe this or don't say this, or else we're going to ban you, or we're going to jail you, or we're going to find you, etc., etc., etc. And ultimately the problem is that's just an invalid argument. It doesn't actually prove anything. And from a psychological perspective, it actually makes people less likely to want to agree with you. There's a psychological phenomenon known as a psychological reactance theory that has been reproduced several times and confirmed by numerous studies. The TLDR of it is you're more likely to get people to agree with you or want to go along with you if you just politely ask them to do so than if you try to threaten them to do so. Because when people perceive that there's some kind of threat to their freedom to act, they immediately dislike that because people generally don't like having their freedom taken away. And so ad baculum is actually an extremely unconvincing argument. It might get some compliance from the sheeple, but it doesn't actually really convince anybody. In fact, if anything, it does the opposite. According to psychological reactance theory, it actually increases people's negative attitude towards you and actually makes them want to disagree with the people doing the censorship. And from this, we can discern the reason why censorship prevents things from being challenged. Because ultimately, the TLDR of it is that censorship is just a bad argument. That's really all it is. TLDR, censorship, from a logic perspective, from a perspective of discerning truth, is just a really, really, really terrible, unconvincing argument that, if anything, convinces people of the opposite. It actually makes people want to disagree with your position even more. And indeed, when you look at a lot of censorship on the internet, a lot of the people who are heavy on it, they don't look cool, they don't look interesting, they don't look like they have facts on their side. They end up looking neurotic and deranged. Like, for example, there's a subreddit called The Right Can't Meme, where they post various right-wing memes and talk about how bad they think they are. And the problem is, many right-wing memes are actually quite funny. And so they made a rule in order to avoid the problem of people using their subreddit to find good memes in order to deface the memes by drawing a red X through them. But that doesn't actually defeat the meme. In fact, hilariously, by doing so, they're actually suggesting that the right can indeed meme. Because otherwise, why would they need to put a red X through it? Why would they need to have this effective bad argument against these memes? And the same reasoning really just applies to all the other examples I've given in this video. There's no need to censor something or put a taboo on a specific subject or whatever if you have good arguments or good evidence against it. And so when the censorship champions come out and just use censorship against everything they don't like, it just makes it look like they don't have a good argument against it, which may or may not be the case. And many times the censorship is really just coming from someone who does have a good argument and they're tired of making it over and over again, which is why physical removal is often a good thing. But beyond that, hopefully everybody now understands why censorship is historically ineffective. It's not because the truth eventually gets out, it's because the very act of censorship itself is a fallacy. And so if you do want to reach truth, it is actually faster to get there by not engaging in censorship. And as long as the midwits who are incapable of understanding this are in charge of our institutions, we're unfortunately probably going to find ourselves banging heads into this wall over and over and over again. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, buying some merch, or again, checking out this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Thanks again for watching. That is all. Till next time.